Hey, beautiful creatives. Welcome to Life by Design, the podcast. Thanks for joining me, your host, Nicki Traikos. I'm an artist, letterer, instructor, and creative business owner. I started and built Life by Design from home while raising a family and learning how to juggle it all. This podcast is my way of pulling back the curtain and inviting you to step into my home studio so we can get candid about all things art, business, and life, so I can help you create a life that you design. Hey, welcome to episode number 6. This episode is all about art supplies and ones that I can't live without. Also, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my philosophy on buying supplies, and it's just another area where I go against the grain, I think. Okay, let's dive in, shall we? So by now, you've probably learned a little bit about me and my philosophy around art, creating art, and just having fun with it. I don't really adhere to a lot of traditional philosophy around art or creativity and even business in general, but I believe that we should do what works for us without putting pressure on doing things the right way or using the proper tools or making sure the technique is very traditional in its form. Know what I mean? Instead, I believe that you should use what you have the means to buy, and upgrade when you can, and just freaking enjoy the process and let creating be what lifts you up. Let's just make it light and easy, joy-filled and fun. Sound good? Okay, so I suggest that you allow yourself the freedom to create with whatever you can get your hands on. So we're limited. We're limited by where we can go, especially with everything happening in the world. Amazon tends to be a favorite just because I can't seem to get supplies in my local art supply store. But the most important thing is just enjoy what I have, enjoy the process, and try to love on the results. So let's talk a little bit about art supplies as we go, and I'll share with you my philosophy around what you should splurge on, what you should have on hand to start building your artist toolbox, if you will. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit before we get started about why I decided to record this episode. I feel like that backstory sometimes can make what I'm sharing a little bit more meaningful. So I'm in a few Facebook groups that are very art focused. Some are watercolor, some are lettering, some are just taught by other teachers whose classes I take. And what I find is that there's a big divide between people who are, I would say, maybe more formally trained in visual arts, or even just have a very traditional sense of what that means or what art means. And then ones who are just beginners, and maybe they just decided to take a class during COVID because they were having to be under lockdown or socially distancing and needed an escape. So they're very beginners. They don't have any training. Maybe art to them was something that they always dreamed of doing, or maybe it was something that they've always thought of trying but never had the time or the opportunity. So what I noticed were in these discussions, there was a lot of conversation around art supplies, because that's one thing people tend to struggle with. They don't know what to buy. An art store can be very daunting and intimidating. So the question from beginners often was, oh, I bought this set of art or watercolor paints and I don't know if it's a good one, or should I buy, this one instead? And there was a lot of contrasting opinions on the types of art supplies people should be spending money on, and what brand was the best, and what was professional, and what was good quality. I was kind of the mindset, like, who cares? Just buy what you can get your hands on and start. Just buy whatever paper you can afford and put some watercolor marks down and just enjoy it. Enjoy seeing what comes to be. So this is where I feel like my philosophy around art and art supplies kind of goes against the grain. So I'm going to tell you that I have painted professional pieces of painting. And what means professional anyway? So what makes something professional? Well, I feel that if you are being paid for your art, then that makes you a professional. So art pieces that have hung in art shows and our local art gallery, I've used student grade quality paints and pencils and made marks with those exact tools and sold it for a very reasonable price, but a very good price. And it didn't matter. The person buying my artwork didn't notice that it wasn't a professional grade of Winsor Newton watercolor paint, or that I used a student grade Prima Marketing watercolor pan set, which I love. Okay, so the basis of this episode really is all about just be free, buy what you can afford and what you can get your hands on. And I'm going to give you some of my favorites along the way. Okay, so let's get started. So again, my philosophy on buying art supplies, I'm not so snobby. I don't believe that you have to spend, the most money you can to get the highest quality, right? I'm going to tell you a little bit about why the item is my favorite and how I like to use it when it's appropriate. So let's talk about lettering and calligraphy supplies. I love traditional dip pen and ink modern calligraphy. I use traditional in that the tool is traditional, very tactile, very basic, very analog. And I would always pick up a straight pen before anything else. So I prefer a straight pen versus an oblique pen. I have a small collection of beautiful pens that I've been gifted or have bought over the years. I like that they're universal, so I can pretty much use any nib with a straight pen. But if you're just starting out, Speedball makes a really great, inexpensive plastic straight pen. It probably is only a couple of dollars and it lasts forever. So no matter how much water or ink I get on it, it still works great. I have beautiful wood straight pens that have absorbed so much water over time that they're cracking and peeling. I still use them, but again, with this plastic variety, it lasts forever and is very low maintenance. So I find when I work with an oblique pen, I tend to write more flourish and on an angle, which doesn't always suit my style depending on what piece I'm working on. But I do have an adjustable oblique pen that I use for workshops and some of my work. I can remove the flange and use it as a straight pen too. Bonus, one inexpensive pen serves dual purpose. And that also is a plastic Speedball pen, okay? Probably closer to $10 or $12, but definitely worth the investment. You'll have it forever. Now, as for nibs, Nico G is a go-to for sure. Just like a Zebra G, it's probably the most popular nib out there by many calligraphers, but I also love Leonard nibs by Manuscript. They have really great flex and are really enjoyable to use. So sometimes when you want a nice thick downstroke, that Leonard nib does it best for me. I feel like nibs, though, tend to be a little bit of trial and error. So my top go-tos for you, try the Nico G for sure. You'll love it. Zebra G, those two are nibs that I've taught with, but the Leonard tend to have a nice, beautiful flex. And also, they even hold more ink, which is great because then you don't have to keep redipping as much. So to finish up on calligraphy supply list, Speedball ink in black is always on hand at my desk. I can use that for a variety of art purposes, not only just calligraphy, but I find it's inexpensive and I can use it on a lot of different types of paper. So unless they're really cotton-based, which then absorbs everything, I'll use gouache instead. Otherwise, Speedball is my go-to ink. Oh, and if you have gouache on hand or even watercolor, try mixing a nice opaque but watery, kind of like a dish soap texture mix so that you can put that in a small container, dip your pen into that mixture, and use it for lettering. The beautiful thing is you can play around with colors and hues and have a lot of fun with it. But just remember, you'll have to play around with the right consistency to make your paint flow through the pen and so that it can glide easily onto the paper. But give it a try. It's so awesome. So speaking of paper, Borden and Riley make the best paper pads. They are transparent or opaque, and the varieties that they come in are great for markers and dip pens as well. I use them for practice. I create finished pieces for clients with the Borden and Riley pads, and I can do anything with just those really simple tools. So not a huge investment if you're looking to do some dip pen calligraphy with those supplies. So next up, if you are thinking about, where do you need to splurge when it comes to calligraphy or lettering in general, I would say paper will be your most expensive purchase and is where you can splurge if your budget allows. Paper will make all the difference in the world when it comes to dip pen calligraphy, but play around, experiment with different paper, and you'll get an idea of what you love and what suits your purpose best. Now for brush pen lettering, My top choice of a pen would be the Pentel Sign pen. I like the stiffness and I really like the color of the ink. I prefer a small brush pen like the Pentel Sign pen. I don't use brush pens very often. I don't love them. I feel like I'll use them for when I want a bit of bold, maybe more modern lettering versus calligraphy. But the Pentel Sign pen would be my top pick. And I use that with my Borden and Riley. Super easy. I don't need to go and buy more paper. I can just pick up a different pen tool. Now, the last tool that I would use for lettering or calligraphy has to be hands down the Gouache. And I would even pick up the Gouache, the watercolor brush pen, over my Pentel Sign pen. I use a tip that is fine. So there's a few different sizes. There's fine, medium, large. There's even different angles. But I love the fine tip. And it is hands down my favorite for lettering and simple embellishments that I can do easily with watercolor. Okay, so I can do some really fun watercolor letter techniques. I can use different colors when I'm creating that lettering, but I can also paint some simple motifs for embellishment. If you haven't tried the Gouache brush, I highly recommend it. And you can use watercolor paper when you paint some beautiful greeting cards. It's one of my favorite things to do, actually, use the Gouache brush and my Prima Marketing palette. It's a dry watercolor palette. Super easy, inexpensive, and you can make fun projects with it. You got to give it a try. So moving on to watercolor. It's kind of like my favorite thing right now. Been doing a lot of watercolor painting and teaching. So I've got a lot to share about this area. So I've been using Canson XL watercolor paper for a while, and the reason is it's cheap. I can get my hands on it quite easily. It's good for practice, and I've even used it for finished paintings. It doesn't allow for super bright color saturation, so when the paint's dry, the colors tend to dry a little bit more muted, but I'm okay with that. It suits my color palette and my style anyway. Right now, I'm playing around with fluid watercolor paper. I kind of like it. I feel like the colors are a bit more bright. Make sure that you're using 140-pound minimum. And again, something that you can play around with. Now, there's another brand. I'm totally going to butcher the name. I think it's Henna Mule. It is a line of paper that I've read about a lot online, and I quite like it. I just bought a small palette to try it out, and I'll keep you posted on what I think of it. Maybe I'll even do a YouTube tutorial. I'm thinking I haven't done one in a while. I have lots of tutorials on YouTube. Not sure if you're a YouTube subscriber, but you should check them out. A lot of tips and how-tos, and maybe I'll even do one on watercolor paper so you can visually see the difference and even the difference in texture. I feel like that's a big one too. Okay, I'll put that in the show notes. YouTube, watercolor, and lettering tutorials. More coming up too, hopefully. So now, as for the watercolor paint, this is where there's a lot of controversy in that Facebook group I was telling you about. So here is my views on watercolor paint. I'm loving Daniel Smith watercolor tubes at the moment. I have maybe 3 or 4 different colors now, and I'm quite enjoying them. They dry with a really lovely finish. It's like textury and interesting. I normally would reach for a Winsor & Newton when I'm buying watercolor tubes, and I love both their professional line as well as their student grade, or I guess like the less professional line. I don't really fuss over the level of watercolor paint, especially since my watercolor style is more modern and loose. It tends to be more forgiving, and again, I don't concern myself too much. Like I've mentioned, I also love Prima Marketing palettes. They are great for beginners. They have fantastic travel options, beautiful colors, and again, my modern watercolor doesn't have to be precious, and I don't have to worry about the highest quality of paints. I actually like their chalky finish. I feel like it's more of a gouache than a watercolor sometimes, and I'm totally okay with that. Again, I've painted some beautiful designs that I've digitized and used for everything from wall art to greeting cards to phone cases and pillowcases. Okay, so don't be too fussy or too snobby when it comes to paints. Now, what I do recommend that you have is a white gouache tube, really good for highlights. And gouache is very similar to watercolor in that it's a little bit more opaque and you can layer it. But white is really great for when you just need to add a little bit of highlights to mix in with your watercolor. You can even use the white gouache to mix in with your watercolors to lighten them a bit, but be aware that it will make them milky. So adding that white gouache to your watercolor will make the color milky. But again, it's kind of cool. I really like the finish and I like the muddy colors. It's just my style. Yours might be a little different. So while we're talking about watercolor and gouache and paints, I'm going to share with you some of my favorite colors that I can't paint without. So if you are buying a tube of watercolor, I actually really like the tubes of watercolor. I feel like it's just easier to mix. I can squeeze out as much as I want. I have different palettes on the go depending on the color stories I'm working on. But my favorite colors to have on hand are Permanent Rose, Sap Green, Payne's Gray, and Yellow Ochre, just to name a few. Oh, and I guess Buff Titanium. I love that color too. It's muted and it makes my other colors that I mix really dusty and moody, which I like again. Now, as for brushes, I always pick up a round brush. I can paint everything with it, from lettering to fine stems to big, beautiful florals. A round brush is my go-to. So a brand of brushes that I really love is Princeton. Anything in their heritage line, I feel like has really nice snap. The brush itself holds its shape and they're really easy to use. So I would say invest in a Princeton heritage brush if you can, and a size maybe 4 or 6, depending again how big your paper is and what you are painting on. So again, talking about paper, I would say your biggest splurge would probably be your paper here, and maybe even your paint. So think about this though. Watercolor, you really need very little pigment. So if you're investing in a tube of paint that's maybe $18, you'll have that tube of paint for a very, very long time. So when you break it down, it ends up costing you pennies. So invest in some good tube paints, buy some colors that speak to you, and remember that you can mix any color using your primaries, red, yellow, and blue. Again, I think I have a YouTube video that shows you how to mix some colors. Check that out if you want. Now moving on to just a few of my go-tos in terms of what I always have at my desk. I always have mixed media sketchbooks. Above Ground is an art supply store in Toronto, and I love their name brand sketchbooks. They're some of my favorite. I can lay down acrylics in them, gouache, charcoal, willow sticks, whatever. So they're great for sketching and they're great for painting. So not a lot of heavy wet medium, but you definitely can plan out some really great pieces using a mixed media sketchbook. So make sure the paper is a little bit heavier and that it does accept wet mediums. For sketching and drawing, Blackwing pencils are always my favorite. I love mechanical pencils for when I need more fine lines, especially if I'm using guidelines to paint. Generals is also a favorite pencil of mine. I love anything that has a soft, like a 6B or an 8B that's really soft and kind of charcoaly so that I can smudge and blend and just have fun with my drawings. So as far as inking, when I need to use ink pens to create some illustrations or drawings, I love the Staedtler. They're fantastic. I'll use them for lettering. I'll even draw outlines for some of my motifs when I'm doing digital designs. They're waterproof, so I'll even go over top of them with some watercolor. And they're pretty great. They're smudge proof, and even when I'm erasing pencil marks, they're not as deep of a black, which is okay because I feel like they do just the round. They create just the right amount of outline for when I am working on pieces that I need to add a little bit of color to. Okay, so the Staedtler is really great. And they come in different sizes. I'd say I'm always drawn to a number 1 or even a 0.5 tends to be a really nice, thin, fine line. Okay. So I think that's about it when it comes to supplies that I must have at my desk. I mean, other than some pastels that I love to use in my larger original pieces, and even I would say acrylic paints. I mean, I could talk about that. I'm not sure if that's your vibe, but acrylic paints, I tend to find that's where I spend the most money, and I go through them like crazy because I work on bigger pieces. Spend within your means, and you'll be happy with what you're creating. Then it doesn't feel so precious. Don't you find that sometimes if you buy something that's really expensive in terms of your art supply, that it feels very precious and you're almost afraid to use it? I know that happens with journals and notebooks, but just spend within your means and really enjoy using it. Okay. So when it comes to supplies, there are some things that I want you just to keep in mind. So again, don't stress about having the best quality or the most professional. And like I said, don't feel intimidated around using what you're buying. You're worth it. And most often, if you can splurge on supplies, it'll help the process of painting or lettering. I just don't want you to feel that you have to keep up on the supply front, though, okay? So don't worry about what people are saying in groups. Like I said, was caught off guard, but whatever. And if there's one tool that I recommend you spend more money on, I would say it's your paintbrush. And a good quality paintbrush should last you for years and years if you take care of it properly. So if you are spending $40 on a brush that lasts you 10 years, how much really is that saving you? Right? Like, think about it. Instead of buying 10 brushes that are cheaper and that fray and you'll find the bristles will drop, spend that $40 on that brush, love on that brush, don't leave it in water sitting, let it dry flat, and it will last you forever. And also remember that when you're starting out, buy a few items that you need to get started. So if you're just starting with watercolor, buy a round brush, buy a few of your favorite watercolor paints, like your favorite colors, and then you can mix anything you want. Buy the best quality paper that you can stomach and get started. So just get started painting. If it's a new hobby especially, or if it's a new craft, it's a new art, get the supplies that you need to get a taste to see if it's something that you really want to stick with and you want to continue with. Okay? So I hope all of this advice about tools and supplies have helped you, and I hope that it inspires you to maybe go pick up a few things and just sit at your desk and paint and let the colors come to life, or letter. Write some words that speak to you and see how it goes. Let me know if you like this episode, and as always, please share so that others can find our podcast. And if you enjoyed, you can subscribe. We're on most podcast providers now anyway. So thanks again for tuning in. Happy creating and happy supply shopping. And I'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now.